Man alone rescued the young native caught in an iron trap. Gives the next morning, she was in his hut asking to be his. The scream that pierced through the Colorado wilderness at dawn would haunt Garrett Thorne for the rest of his days. Not because it was the first cry of agony he had heard echoing through these unforgiving mountains, but because something in that voice made his weathered hands freeze on the reins of his sorrel mare. 3 years of complete solitude had taught him to ignore most sounds. The howl of wolves, the crack of thunder, even the occasional gunshot from distant settlements meant nothing to a man who had deliberately chosen to disappear from civilization. But this scream carried something different, something that made his chest tighten with a feeling he thought he had buried along with his past. Garrett had been riding through the dense pine forest since before sunrise, checking his trap lines for the beaver pelts that kept him fed and clothed through the harsh mountain winters. His cabin sat tucked away in a valley so remote that most maps did not even acknowledge its existence. He preferred it that way. After what happened in Denver, after the trial and the whispers that followed him like shadows, anonymity had become his only companion. The second scream came louder, more desperate. This time, Garrett could tell it was a woman, young by the pitch of her voice, and she was not just crying out in fear or anger, she was trapped. His mare snorted and danced nervously beneath him, sensing his internal conflict. 3 years of self-imposed exile had been built on one simple rule: mind your own business and let the world mind its own. Getting involved meant complications. Complications meant people asking questions. Questions meant the past catching up with him. But that scream came again, weaker now, fading into a sob that seemed to echo off every tree trunk and boulder in the forest. Garrett cursed under his breath and spurred his horse toward the sound. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 that hung low on his hip, though he doubted this situation would call for gunplay. More likely, it would call for the kind of human decency that he had been avoiding for 3 long years. The forest opened into a small clearing where morning sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden streams. What Garrett saw there made his blood run cold. A young woman knelt beside a massive pine tree, her right leg caught in one of the cruelest contraptions man had ever devised for hunting animals. An iron leg trap, its serrated teeth biting deep into her calf, held her prisoner with merciless efficiency. She was native. That much was obvious from her long black hair and the beaded leather dress that had been torn during her struggle to escape. But everything else about her defied every assumption Garrett might have made. Her skin was lighter than he expected, suggesting mixed heritage. Her features were delicate but fierce, and when she looked up at him with eyes the color of dark amber, he saw not fear but raw determination. Blood soaked the ground around the trap. She had been fighting against it for hours, maybe all night. Her hands were scraped raw from clawing at the metal jaws, and exhaustion had painted dark circles under her eyes. Yet she met his gaze without flinching, as if she were evaluating him just as carefully as he was studying her. "Easy there," Garrett said, dismounting slowly with his hands visible. "I am not going to hurt you," she spoke then, in a language he did not recognize. The words flowed like water over stones, musical despite the pain that laced through them. When he looked confused, she switched to accented English that carried the weight of formal education. "You are not the one who set this trap. It was not a question." Somehow, she had sized him up and determined his character in the span of a heartbeat. Garrett found himself oddly impressed by her composure under circumstances that would have sent most people into panic. "No, I am not," he confirmed, kneeling beside the trap to examine its mechanism. "But I know who did, Ezra Canton. He has been setting these things all through the territory, trying to catch wolves for the bounty." The woman winced as Garrett tested the trap's release mechanism. The iron had bitten deep, and moving it even slightly sent fresh blood flowing from the wounds. She would need medical attention soon, or infection would set in. "This is going to hurt," he warned. "Everything hurts," she replied with a bitter smile. "Do what you must." Garrett positioned himself carefully, placing his boots on either side of the trap's springs. It would require every ounce of his strength to compress them enough to release the jaws. The woman braced herself against the tree trunk, her knuckles white with the effort of staying conscious. "On 3, Garrett said. 1.2. He threw his full weight onto the springs before reaching 3, knowing that anticipation would only make it worse for her. The metal groaned and slowly began to separate. The woman's sharp intake of breath was the only sound she made as the serrated teeth pulled free from her flesh. The moment the trap released, Garrett kicked it away into the underbrush where it could cause no more harm. The woman slumped forward, finally allowing exhaustion and pain to claim her. Dark blood flowed freely from multiple puncture wounds that would need immediate attention. Garrett tore strips from his own shirt to create makeshift bandages. As he worked, he found himself studying her face more closely. She was younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 20 years old. But her eyes held the kind of wisdom that usually came with much harder living. "What is your name?" he asked as he wrapped her wounds. "Ayanna," she answered softly. "It means eternal blossom in my mother's tongue." "Garrett Thorne," he replied, then immediately wondered why he had given his real name. For 3 years, he had been John Smith or Tom Brown or any other forgettable combination to the few people he encountered. Something about this woman made deception feel wrong. "You live near here, Garrett Thorne?" The way she said his name, with careful attention to each syllable, made it sound almost musical. He nodded toward the mountains that rose beyond the clearing. "About 2 miles north. You need proper medical attention." "Those wounds are deep." Ayanna struggled to stand, testing her weight on the injured leg. She managed 3 steps before her strength gave out. Without thinking, Garrett caught her before she could fall. "I can walk," she insisted, though her body told a different story. "Maybe so, but not 2 miles through mountain terrain." He looked at his horse, then back at her torn dress and bloodied leg. "Can you ride?" "I can ride anything with 4 legs." There was pride in her voice that made Garrett smile despite the circumstances. He helped her onto his mare, then swung up behind her. The horse adjusted to the double load without complaint, though the journey back to his cabin would be slower than usual. As they rode through the forest, Garrett became acutely aware of Ayanna's presence. She sat straight in the saddle despite her injuries, her hair catching sunlight that filtered through the pine boughs. There was something about her that reminded him of everything he had tried to leave behind in civilization. Strength, dignity, hope. Things that had no place in the life of a man who had chosen exile over redemption. "Why do you live alone in these mountains?" she asked as they climbed a narrow trail that wound between massive boulders. "Same reason most people do anything." Seemed like the best choice at the time. And now? Garrett considered the question more seriously than he wanted to. "Now I am not so sure about anything." His cabin appeared around a bend in the trail, looking smaller and more primitive than usual with a visitor to see it through fresh eyes. He had built it himself using logs from the surrounding forest, with a stone chimney and a roof that leaked only slightly during heavy rains. It was functional rather than beautiful, designed for survival rather than comfort. "It is not much," he said as he helped her down from the horse. "It is yours," Ayanna replied, as if that settled the matter entirely. Inside, Garrett settled her on his single chair while he gathered supplies to properly clean her wounds. The cabin's interior was as sparse as its exterior suggested. One room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and living area. A cast iron stove, a rough wooden table, shelves lined with supplies and books, and a bed that had seen better years. Everything a man needed and nothing he did not. "You read," Ayanna observed, noting the books that lined one wall. "Helps pass the winter nights." Garrett knelt beside her chair with a bowl of clean water and cloth bandages. "This is going to hurt worse than the trap." She gripped the arms of the chair as he began cleaning the wounds. Each puncture was deep and ragged, but thankfully none had damaged major arteries or tendons. With proper care, she would heal without permanent damage. "You have done this before," she said, watching him work with steady hands. "I have done a lot of things before." There was something in his tone that discouraged further questions, at least for now. Ayanna studied his face as he concentrated on her injuries. He was older than she had first thought, probably closer to 30 than 25. His hair was dark brown with streaks of premature gray at the temples. His face was lean and weathered from years of outdoor living, but his hands were gentle despite their obvious strength. When he finished bandaging her leg, Garrett sat back on his heels and surveyed his work. "That should hold, but you need to keep weight off it for at least a week. Maybe 2. I cannot stay here for 2 weeks. Where else are you going to go?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from the fireplace. Ayanna looked around the cabin as if seeing it for the first time, taking in its isolation and its implications. "My people will be looking for me," she said finally. "What people?" "There has not been a native settlement within 50 miles of here for years." Something flickered across her face. "Pain, maybe, or loss." "That is a long story. I have got nothing but time." Ayanna was quiet for so long that Garrett thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of old wounds. "My father was white. A trader who worked with the Cherokee before they were forced from their lands. My mother was Cherokee. When the removal happened, she chose to stay hidden in the mountains rather than walk the trail to Oklahoma." Garrett had heard stories about the Cherokee removal, though he had been too young at the time to understand the full scope of the tragedy. Thousands of people forced from their ancestral homes and marched across the country to unfamiliar territory. Many had died along the way. "She raised me in the old ways," Ayanna continued, "teaching me the language, the customs, the skills needed to survive. But when she died last winter, I found myself caught between 2 worlds. Too Cherokee for white society, too white for what remains of Cherokee society. So you came here." "I came here because I heard there were still free Cherokee in these mountains. People who had never surrendered, never been removed. I have been searching for them for months." Garrett felt something twist in his chest. He recognized the pain in her voice because he had felt it himself, the loneliness that came from belonging nowhere and to no one. "I have been living in these mountains for 3 years, he said gently. "I have never seen any Cherokee settlements. If they exist, they are well hidden." The disappointment that crossed her face was almost unbearable to witness. She had been clinging to hope, and he had just taken it away with a few honest words. "Then I have been chasing shadows," she whispered. "Maybe. Or maybe you just have not found the right place yet." It was a weak comfort, but it was all he could offer. Ayanna leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes, finally allowing exhaustion to claim her. The morning's ordeal, combined with months of searching and the trauma of her injuries, had pushed her beyond her limits. "Sleep," Garrett said softly. "We can figure out the rest later." But as he watched her drift off in his chair, Garrett knew that nothing about his carefully constructed solitude would ever be the same. For 3 years he had successfully avoided human connection. Now, in the space of a few hours, this young woman had shattered the walls he had built around his life. The question was whether he would have the courage to let her stay, or whether he would send her away to preserve the isolation that had become his prison. Outside, his horse nickered softly in the afternoon breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it circled above the endless expanse of wilderness that had become their world. When Ayanna woke several hours later, the cabin was filled with the golden light of late afternoon. The smell of rabbit stew filled the air, and Garrett stood at the stove stirring a pot with practiced efficiency. She watched him for a moment, noting how he moved with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to taking care of himself. "How long was I sleeping?" she asked, testing her injured leg gingerly. "Long enough for me to catch dinner and wonder if I should have taken you to Doc Morrison in Willow Creek instead." "Who is Doc Morrison?" "The closest thing to a real doctor within 100 miles. He has a practice above the saloon in town." Garrett ladled stew into a wooden bowl and handed it to her. Still not too late to take you there. Ayana accepted the bowl gratefully. The stew was simple but well seasoned, with chunks of rabbit meat and wild onions that must have grown near his cabin. You do not want to go to town. It was a statement rather than a question, and Garrett found himself impressed once again by her perceptiveness. Towns ask questions. I prefer to avoid questions. What kind of questions? Garrett settled into the chair across from her with his own bowl, considering how much truth he was willing to share. Something about Ayana made him want to be honest, but 3 years of practiced secrecy were hard to overcome. The kind that do not have good answers, he said finally. They ate in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent toward the mountains. Through the single window, Ayana could see peaks that stretched endlessly into the distance, their snow-capped summits painted pink and orange by the dying light. It was beautiful and harsh and utterly unforgiving. You built this place yourself, she observed, noting the careful craftsmanship in the log walls and stone fireplace. Had plenty of time and nothing else to do. It is a good place to disappear. Garrett looked up from his stew, startled by her directness. What makes you think I disappeared? A man does not live alone in the wilderness for 3 years unless he is running from something. The question is whether you are running from other people or from yourself. The accuracy of her observation made Garrett uncomfortable. He stood abruptly and began clearing away the empty bowls, using activity to avoid her penetrating gaze. You need rest, he said. Take the bed. I will sleep on the floor. I cannot take your bed. You can and you will. You are injured and you are my guest. There was finality in his tone that brooked no argument. Ayana allowed him to help her to the narrow bed, where she settled carefully onto the rough wool blankets. Her leg throbbed with each heartbeat, but the pain was manageable now that the wounds had been properly cleaned. Garrett, she said as he prepared a bedroll on the floor near the fireplace. Yes? Thank you for helping me, for bringing me here. He nodded without looking at her, uncomfortable with gratitude in the same way he was uncomfortable with most human emotions. Get some sleep. But sleep did not come easily for either of them. Ayana lay in the darkness listening to Garrett move restlessly on his makeshift bed while he stared at the ceiling trying to ignore her presence in his space. 3 years of solitude had not prepared him for sharing his sanctuary with another person, especially not a woman who seemed to see through his carefully constructed defenses. Dawn brought the sound of rain against the cabin windows, a steady drumming that promised to continue for hours. Garrett woke to find Ayana already awake, sitting up in bed and watching the storm through the window with an expression of quiet contentment. How is the leg? He asked, stoking the fire back to life. Better. Still painful, but better. She proved it by standing and taking a few careful steps around the cabin. The wounds were healing cleanly, with no signs of infection. Her strength was returning, though she would need several more days before she could walk any significant distance. The rain will make travel difficult anyway, Garrett said, as much to himself as to her. Probably best to wait until it clears. Over the next 3 days, they settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Garrett tended to his traps and hunting, while Ayana occupied herself with small tasks around the cabin. She mended his torn shirts with neat stitches learned from her Cherokee mother, organized his scattered supplies, and cooked meals that were far more flavorful than anything he had prepared for himself in years. They spoke little at first, but gradually began sharing fragments of their stories. Ayana told him about her childhood in the hidden valleys where her mother had taught her to track game and read weather, patterns in the movement of clouds. Garrett found himself talking about his years as a deputy marshal in Denver, carefully omitting the events that had driven him into exile. On the 4th morning, the rain finally stopped. Bright sunlight streamed through the windows, and the air outside smelled clean and fresh. Ayana stood at the window looking out at the dripping forest, and Garrett knew she was thinking about leaving. Your leg is strong enough for short walks now, he said, but not for long distances. Not yet. How long? she asked without turning around. Another week, maybe 2. Depends on how fast you heal. They both knew she could probably manage to travel sooner if necessary. The question was whether either of them wanted her to leave at all. That afternoon, while Garrett checked his trap lines, Ayanna explored the area around the cabin. Her leg held her weight well enough for short excursions, and she found herself drawn to a small meadow about a quarter-mile from his door. Wildflowers carpeted the grass in brilliant colors, and a clear stream ran along one edge, providing fresh water and the musical sound of flowing current. She was sitting beside the stream, soaking her feet in the cold water, when Garrett found her on his return. "This is a beautiful spot," she said as he approached. "I come here sometimes when the cabin feels too small." He sat down beside her on the grassy bank, noting how the afternoon light caught the copper highlights in her dark hair. Over the past few days, he had found himself noticing things about her that had nothing to do with her injuries or her circumstances. The way she hummed softly while working, the graceful movement of her hands when she cooked, the quiet strength that radiated from her even in moments of rest. "Garrett," she said, still watching the water flow over smooth stones. "What happened in Denver?" The question hung between them like a challenge. For days he had been wondering when she would ask directly instead of probing around the edges of his secrets. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I am trying to decide whether you are a good man who made a mistake or a bad man who got caught." Her honesty was both refreshing and terrifying. Garrett picked up a smooth pebble and skipped it across a deeper pool in the stream, buying time while he decided how much truth he could bear to share. "There was a trial," he said finally. "I was accused of taking bribes from a gang of cattle rustlers, looking the other way while they operated in exchange for a cut of their profits. Were you guilty?" "The jury thought so." "That is not what I asked." Garrett met her eyes, seeing no judgment there, only the same direct honesty she had shown from the beginning. "No, I was not guilty, but the evidence against me was convincing, and I had made enemies among the other lawmen, men who were happy to see me fall. So you were framed." "Seems likely, though I never found out by who or why." Ayanna nodded as if his explanation confirmed what she had already suspected. "And rather than fight to clear your name, you disappeared. Fighting would have meant staying in Denver. Staying meant dealing with people who had already decided I was corrupt. It seemed easier to start over somewhere else." "Easier for who?" The question stung because it forced him to confront the selfishness of his choice. Running away had been easier for him, but it had also meant abandoning any chance of finding the real culprits or clearing his reputation. "You think I should have stayed and fought," he said. "I think you are still fighting. Just fighting different battles now." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the water and watching clouds drift across the sky. Finally, Ayanna spoke again. "My mother used to say that we cannot outrun our true nature. We can hide from it for a while, but eventually it catches up with us." "What was your true nature?" "I am still figuring that out. But I know it is not hiding in the mountains forever, searching for people who may not exist." That evening, they prepared dinner together in the small kitchen. Ayanna had found wild greens during her walk, and she showed Garrett how to prepare them in the Cherokee way, with bacon fat and a touch of maple syrup. As they worked side by side, their hands occasionally brushed, and Garrett found himself acutely aware of her presence. "You never married," she said, noting the complete absence of feminine touches in the cabin. "Never found the right person. Or maybe the right person never found me. What would the right person be like?" The question caught him off guard, and he found himself studying her face as he considered his answer. "Strong enough to survive out here. Smart enough to see through my defenses. Brave enough to stick around anyway." Something shifted in the air between them. A recognition that they were no longer talking in hypotheticals. Ayanna set down the wooden spoon she had been using to stir their dinner and turned to face him fully. "Garrett, yes? I want to stay." The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Garrett felt his heart racing as he processed what she was offering and what it would mean. "You do not even know me," he said. "I know you risked your own safety to help a stranger. I know you have been gentle and generous with someone who had no claim on your kindness. I know you are a good man who has been hurt badly enough to hide from the world. Y-A-N, double counts, and I know that for the first time in months, I feel like I belong somewhere." She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the wildflower soap she had found among his supplies, close enough to see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. "You belong with your own people," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I have been searching for my people for 8 months. Maybe I already found them." When she reached up to touch his face, Garrett felt the last of his resistance crumble. He had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what human connection felt like. Her touch reminded him of everything he had given up when he chose exile over fighting for his innocence. "I am not the kind of man you should get involved with," he said. "Let me decide what kind of man I want." This time, when she moved closer, he did not pull away. Instead, he found himself reaching for her, drawing her against him with hands that trembled slightly from the unfamiliarity of intimate contact. When their lips met, it felt like coming home after a long and painful journey. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both testing the reality of what was happening between them. But as Ayanna responded, her arms sliding around his neck, Garrett felt years of careful emotional control begin to dissolve. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Garrett rested his forehead against hers, struggling to process the magnitude of what had just changed between them. "This complicates things," he said. "Good. I like complications." That night, they sat together by the fireplace talking until the flames died down to glowing embers. They shared stories from their childhoods, dreams they had abandoned, fears they had never spoken aloud. For the first time in 3 years, Garrett allowed himself to imagine a future that included another person. When they finally went to bed, Ayanna returned to his narrow bunk while he settled onto his bedroll on the floor. But the distance between them felt different now, charged with possibility rather than mere courtesy. The next morning brought unwelcome visitors. Garrett woke to the sound of horses approaching through the forest. 3 riders, moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew exactly where they were going. He rolled silently from his bedroll and moved to the window, keeping low as he peered through the gap in the curtains. What he saw made his blood run cold. Ezra Canton rode in the lead, his massive frame unmistakable even at a distance. Behind him came 2 other men Garrett recognized from his days as a deputy marshal, Jake Winters and Tom Bradley, both bounty hunters who worked the Colorado Territory with the ruthless efficiency of wolves. "Get dressed," he whispered urgently to Ayanna, who had awakened at the sound of his movement. "We have company." She moved quickly and quietly, understanding the gravity in his voice without needing explanation. Through the window, they watched as the 3 men dismounted near the cabin, their hands resting casually on their gun belts in the universal language of men accustomed to violence. "Thorne." Canton's voice boomed across the clearing. "We know you are in there. Come on out and let us talk like civilized men." Garrett checked his Colt, ensuring the cylinder was fully loaded. 6 shots against 3 men who had made killing their profession. Not impossible odds, but not good ones either. "What do they want?" Ayanna whispered. "Nothing good," Garrett replied, moving to the door but keeping his hand on his weapon. "Stay back and be ready to run if this goes bad." He opened the door slowly, stepping onto the rough wooden porch with his gun still holstered, but his hand hovering near the grip. The 3 men spread out in a loose semicircle, a formation that gave them clear lines of fire while making it difficult for him to target all of them at once. "Ezra," Garrett said calmly. "Been a long time, not long enough. From what I hear." Canton was a big man who had grown bigger over the years, with a belly that strained against his gun belt and small eyes that held no warmth. Word is you have been living up here like some kind of hermit. Makes a man wonder what you might be hiding. Nothing that concerns you or anyone else. See, that is where you are wrong. Jake Winters stepped forward, a thin man with nervous hands that never stopped moving. There is a $500 bounty on your head, Thorne. Dead or alive, though I suspect the Denver authorities would prefer alive so they can make a proper show of your execution. The words hit Garrett like a physical blow. A bounty meant someone had convinced a judge that he was a fugitive from justice, not just a man who had chosen to disappear. It meant they could legally hunt him down and drag him back to face charges that he knew would end with a rope around his neck. $500? Garrett kept his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. Must have made some important enemies to rate that kind of money. Funny thing about bounties, Tom Bradley spoke up from the right side of the semicircle. His voice carried the lazy drawl of a man from Texas, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. They tend to grow over time, especially when the wanted man has been living under an assumed name and evading justice for 3 years. I have not been evading anything. I have been minding my own business in the middle of nowhere, with a stolen horse and stolen supplies, from what we hear. Canton gestured toward the sorrel mare that stood tethered near the cabin. That horse was reported stolen from a livery in Denver 3 years ago, along with saddle, bridle, and enough provisions to last a month. Garrett felt the trap closing around him. The horse had been his, purchased legitimately before his troubles began. But proving that now, with no paperwork and no witnesses, would be impossible. Someone had been very thorough in building a case against him. Even if that were true, he said carefully, stealing a horse is not a capital crime. No, but murder is. The word hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Garrett felt his world tilt as Canton continued speaking. Judge Morrison was found dead in his chambers 2 days after your trial ended. Shot twice in the back. Several witnesses saw a man matching your description leaving the courthouse around the time of the murder. That is impossible. I left Denver immediately after the trial. Can you prove that? Winters asked with a predatory smile. Got any witnesses to your whereabouts that night? Garrett's mind raced through the events of 3 years ago. He had indeed left Denver immediately after the trial, but he had traveled alone and spoken to no one. The perfect circumstances for someone to fabricate evidence against him. You know, I did not kill Judge Morrison, he said, looking directly at Canton. You know, because you know who really did. All I know is what the evidence shows. And the evidence shows you are a wanted man who needs to come back to Denver to face justice. Whose justice? Yours? The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made all 4 men freeze. The unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked, coming from somewhere behind them in the forest. I count 4 men with guns drawn, a voice called out from the trees. That seems like poor odds for a friendly conversation. Garrett recognized the voice immediately. Samuel Cross, a mountain man who lived even deeper in the wilderness than Garrett did. They had encountered each other occasionally over the years, sharing information about weather and game movements but never becoming close friends. This does not concern you, Cross, Canton called back, his head swiveling as he tried to locate the hidden rifleman. Maybe not, but I have always been partial to fair fights. 4 against 1 does not seem fair to me. 3 against 1, Winters corrected. We are not looking for trouble with you. Good to know. Of course, my rifle does not much care what you are looking for. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. 3 bounty hunters who made their living through intimidation and violence, facing a lone mountain man with a rifle and the advantage of cover. Garrett knew that Cross was buying him time, but time for what? He was still outnumbered and outgunned. That was when Ayanna stepped out of the cabin. She moved with quiet grace, carrying herself with the dignity of a queen despite her simple dress and bare feet. In her hands, she held Garrett's spare rifle, and she handled it with the easy familiarity of someone who had learned to shoot before she learned to read. Now it is 3 against 3, she said calmly, taking a position beside Garrett on the porch. Canton's eyes widened as he took in her appearance. "Well, I will be damned. The Cherokee princess herself. Boys, I think we just hit the mother lode." "What are you talking about?" Garrett demanded. "Your lady friend here is worth almost as much as you are. There is a $200 bounty on her head for killing a federal marshal down in New Mexico territory." Garrett felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He looked at Ayanna, seeing her jaw tighten but detecting no surprise in her expression. She had known about the bounty on her head. "That marshal was trying to rape me," she said quietly. "I defended myself. Federal judges tend to take a dim view of anyone who kills their marshals, regardless of the circumstances." Canton was grinning now, sensing that victory was within his grasp. $700 total. That is more money than most men see in 2 years. "You are not taking either of us anywhere," Garrett said firmly. "That remains to be seen." What happened next unfolded with the terrible speed of violence unleashed. Canton went for his gun first, his hand moving toward his holster with practiced efficiency. But Garrett had been expecting it, and his Colt cleared leather a split second faster. The first shot echoed across the clearing like thunder. Canton spun backward, clutching his shoulder as bright red blood seeped through his fingers. Before the echo died, Winters and Bradley were drawing their own weapons. Ayanna's rifle boomed from the porch, and Winters cried out as her bullet shattered his gun hand. His pistol flew spinning through the air to land uselessly in the dirt. Bradley got his gun clear and fired toward the porch, his bullet splintering the wooden post inches from Garrett's head. But before he could fire again, Samuel Cross's rifle spoke from the forest, and Bradley crumpled to the ground with a bullet through his thigh. The fight was over almost before it began. 3 bounty hunters lay wounded in the dirt, their weapons scattered and their confidence shattered. Canton struggled to his feet, still clutching his bleeding shoulder. "This is not over, Thorne," he gasped. "There will be others. The bounties are too high to ignore. Maybe, but you will not be collecting them." Canton and his companions gathered their weapons and limped toward their horses, defeated but not destroyed. They would be back eventually, or others like them would come. The bounties on their heads ensured that Garrett and Ayanna would never truly be safe. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Samuel Cross emerged from the forest. He was a lean man in his 50s, with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades living off the land. "That was some fine shooting," he said, nodding approvingly at Ayanna. "Thank you for your help," Garrett replied. "We owe you." "No, you do not. We look after each other up here." "That is how it works." Cross studied them both for a moment, his experienced eyes taking in their closeness and the way they stood together against the world. "You two cannot stay here," he said finally. "Word will spread about what happened today. More bounty hunters will come, and next time you might not be so lucky." "Where can we go?" Ayanna asked. "There are places. Hidden valleys where the law does not reach and bounty hunters fear to tread. But getting there will not be easy." Garrett looked at his cabin, at the life he had built in 3 years of solitude. Leaving would mean abandoning everything he had worked for, but staying would mean certain death or capture. "How soon do we need to leave?" he asked. "Tonight, if you are smart. Tomorrow morning at the latest." As Samuel Cross disappeared back into the forest, Garrett and Ayanna stood together in the afternoon sun, contemplating the uncertain future that stretched before them. The peaceful life they had begun to imagine was already slipping away, replaced by the harsh reality of running from bounties that would follow them wherever they went. But as Ayanna took his hand in hers, Garrett realized that exile might not be so terrible if they faced it together. They left before dawn, carrying only what they could pack on horseback. Garrett's sorrel-mar carried their supplies while Ayanna rode the spare horse he kept for emergencies. The morning air was crisp and thin, carrying the promise of winter that would come early to these mountains. Samuel Cross had given them directions to a hidden valley 3 days' ride north, where a small community of outcasts and fugitives had established themselves beyond the reach of federal law. It was not much of a destination, but it was better than waiting for the next wave of bounty hunters to arrive. Do you regret it? Ayanna asked as they rode through the pre-dawn darkness. Regret what? Helping me. If you had left me in that trap, you would still have your cabin and your peaceful life. Garrett considered the question seriously. 3 days ago, his biggest concern had been whether his winter meat supply would last until spring. Now he was a fugitive with a $700 bounty on his head, riding toward an uncertain future with a woman he barely knew but was falling in love with. No, he said finally. I do not regret it. Even though it has cost you everything? It has not cost me everything. It has just changed what everything means. They rode in companionable silence as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold and pink. The trail Cross had described was barely visible, more of a game path than anything meant for human travel. But it wound steadily upward through dense forest that would provide cover from anyone following them. By midday, they had climbed high enough that the air grew noticeably thinner. Ayanna's injured leg was causing her pain, though she did not complain. Garrett called a halt beside a small stream where they could rest the horses and refill their water bottles. How are you holding up? He asked as she dismounted carefully. I will survive. The Cherokee are used to long journeys on foot. This is luxury by comparison. She sat on a fallen log and rolled up her pant leg to examine the healing wounds. The punctures were closing cleanly, but the surrounding tissue was still tender and swollen. She had been pushing herself harder than she should, but neither of them had much choice in the matter. Let me see, Garrett said, kneeling beside her. His fingers were gentle as he probed the injured area, checking for signs of infection or reopened wounds. The intimate contact sent warmth spreading through both of them, despite the cold mountain air. It is healing well, he said softly. You are stronger than you look. I have to be. Weak women do not survive long in the wilderness. There was truth in her words, but also sadness. She had been forced to develop strength and independence because the alternative was death. It was not so different from his own journey into solitude. Ayanna, he said, still kneeling before her. When we reach this hidden valley, we need to decide what comes next. What do you mean? I mean, we need to decide if we are running away together or just running in the same direction. She studied his face, seeing the vulnerability he was trying to hide behind practical concerns. What do you want it to be? I want it to be together. But I need to know that is what you want too, not just what circumstances have forced on you. Instead of answering with words, Ayanna leaned forward and kissed him. It was a longer, deeper kiss than the one they had shared in his cabin, filled with promise and commitment and the kind of desperate passion that comes from facing an uncertain future. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Does that answer your question? She asked. It is a good start. They resumed their journey through the afternoon, following a trail that grew steeper and more treacherous with each mile. The horses struggled with the altitude and the rocky terrain, forcing them to dismount and lead the animals through the worst sections. As evening approached, they found themselves on a narrow ledge overlooking a vast canyon. The view was breathtaking, with layers of red rock stretching into the distance and a river winding like a silver ribbon far below. But the beauty was tempered by the realization that they were completely exposed on the open rock face. We need to find shelter for the night, Garrett said, scanning the cliff face for caves or overhangs. There, Ayanna pointed to a narrow opening in the rock about 50 yards ahead. It looks like it goes back far enough to hide the horses. The cave proved to be deeper than it appeared from outside, extending back into the mountain for nearly 30 feet. It was dry and protected from the wind, though cold enough that they would need a fire to stay warm through the night. Garrett gathered wood while Ayanna tended to the horses and prepared a simple meal from their supplies. They worked together with the easy efficiency of a couple who had been partners for years rather than days. Both of them recognized the significance of that cooperation, though neither mentioned it aloud. As they sat by their small fire eating beans and hardtack, Ayanna spoke into the flickering darkness. "Tell me about the judge who was murdered." Garrett stiffened. It was not a subject he wanted to discuss, but he owed her honesty after everything they had been through. "Judge Morrison presided over my trial. He was the one who sentenced me to 10 years in prison before I jumped bail and disappeared. Did you know him before the trial?" "We had met a few times in professional capacity. He seemed like an honest man, though I heard rumors that he had been receiving threats." "What kind of threats?" "The kind that come with making enemies of powerful people. Denver is full of men who make their money through corruption and violence. An honest judge is a threat to that kind of business." Ayanna stared into the fire, processing the implications of what he was telling her. "So someone killed him to frame you for murder. That seems likely, though I have no idea who or why. Maybe because you were getting too close to something. Maybe your investigation into the cattle rustling was about to expose something bigger." It was a possibility Garrett had considered during his 3 years of exile, but he had never pursued it. Running away had seemed easier than fighting back. "Even if that is true, what can we do about it now? I am a wanted man with no resources and no allies. Anyone who might have helped me is either dead or compromised. You have me." The simple statement hit him with unexpected force. After years of believing he was completely alone in the world, the idea of having a partner in both love and adversity was almost overwhelming. "Ayanna, you do not understand what you are offering. If we try to clear my name, we will be putting ourselves directly in the path of very dangerous people. I understand perfectly. I also understand that running for the rest of our lives is not really living." She moved closer to him beside the fire, her hand finding his in the dancing shadows. "My mother used to say that the worst thing that can happen to a person is not death, but becoming so afraid of death that you stop living. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." She was. She was also very brave. When the soldiers came to force the Cherokee from their lands, she could have gone with them to safety. Instead, she chose to stay and fight for what she believed in. And you want to do the same. I want to do what is right, not what is easy or safe. That night, they slept close together for warmth, wrapped in their bedrolls beside the dying embers of their fire. Garrett lay awake listening to Ayanna's quiet breathing and thinking about the choice she was offering him. He could continue running, living like a ghost in hidden places until the bounty hunters finally caught up with him. Or he could find the courage to fight back against the forces that had destroyed his life. When he finally drifted off to sleep, his dreams were filled with images of courtrooms and judges, of shadowy figures plotting in dark rooms, and of a young Cherokee woman who might just be brave enough to help him reclaim his name and his future. They reached the hidden valley on the third day, following a trail so narrow and treacherous that it seemed impossible anyone could have found it by accident. The valley itself was a revelation, a green oasis hidden between towering cliffs that rose like natural fortress walls on all sides. A small community had indeed established itself here, perhaps 30 people living in cabins and lean-tos scattered along a clear mountain stream. They watched with wary eyes as Garrett and Ayanna rode into their sanctuary, hands resting casually on weapons until Samuel Cross emerged from one of the cabins to vouch for the newcomers. "Welcome to Paradise Valley," Cross said with dry humor. "Population, whoever needs to disappear for a while." But as Garrett looked around at the faces of his fellow outcasts, he realized that hiding in paradise was still just another form of prison. And prisons, no matter how beautiful, were not places where a man could build a real life with the woman he loved.